Welcome everybody back to the Doomer Optimism podcast. We are here today with Neal Spackman. I'll let Neal introduce himself, but I want to highlight that the reason I invited him on to, besides all the different things he's been doing in sort of like regeneration more broadly, is I watched this YouTube video about this project he did in Mecca. And I literally cried watching it because of like the ecosystem he created with the team there, and there just wasn't water for, I think there wasn't rainfall, I think, in this area for years. You have to confirm this story, Neal. And then finally the rain fell, and like the ecosystem they created like flourished and came to life. And I was like, I don't know, there's something at the intersection there of I think the ways in which humans can be keystone species and work together, like noticing what's happening in the environment and in the world. And he had like a whole team on the ground of people whom this was, I think, meant to belong to after you left. So I maybe we can talk about that story to start, a short introduction. We can talk about that because like the video was just like so beautifully edited, and by the end I was like almost like felt like this amazing psychedelic experience where like this ecosystem came alive despite all the odds. So anyways, I wanted to start with that, and yeah, I'll let you introduce yourself and we can go from there.
Yeah, that's the Baydha Project that you're talking about, where I did my undergrad work in Middle East Studies, Arabic, and economics, and fell in love with concepts around sustainability, particularly sustainability in the built environment and sustainability in food systems in the early 2000s, like 2003, 2004, and decided at some point that I was going to shift my career into work related to those issues, and had the opportunity to quit an office job in 2010 and move to Mecca and live with tribes of settled nomads to prototype a way to restore what had been their indigenous grazing patterns. And that project was funded by Her Royal Highness Haifa Al Faisal. It was funded and founded by Princess Haifa, who I worked with quite closely for a number of years. And there is a 20-minute video about that. It's like a condensation of 10 years of my life. But it was, for me, that was an opportunity to pivot in the kind of work that I wanted to do with my life. And I didn't have very much experience. I had a lot of book knowledge about it. But I did speak the language. I was very familiar with the culture, and I at least had ideas of what would need to happen. So the region's called Baydha. That's why it's called the Baydha Project. Population of about 15,000 people who were nomadic as recently as 2005, 2006. In fact, there are still a couple nomadic families out there, but they'd be very upset that I was mentioning them, because they mostly just want to stay off everybody's radar. And but people that were nomadic or semi-nomadic settled by government policy, mostly through incentivization. The government built stone houses for them, and they built a paved road. They brought electricity in 2009. And, we were looking, I showed up, and it was after about 100 years of desertification and probably 60 years of really intense desertification, which was caused by a policy that eliminated the traditional tribal boundaries. As part of Saudi's and the greater region's efforts at building nation states rather than tribal-based societies, they essentially abolished the indigenous land management systems as a result of abolishing tribalism in general, trying to combat tribalism in general. And the result of that was a tragedy of the commons and total deforestation and desertification. And that led to what we call the poverty degradation trap, where generally when resources become depleted, people then turn to more destructive practices that in turn deplete resources even faster. And you end up in this really, really vicious cycle. That's happening all over the planet, but in this particular instance, it was already in a very austere place. But in recent memory, this area used to get, 2 rainfalls a year. They would get a summer rain and a winter rain. And they would, all the people are camel and goat herders. Some of them have sheep as well, but primarily they love camels. They love goats and sheep as well, but not as much as the camels. And so it used to be that they had cyclical grazing patterns put in place under a system called the himma. And himma essentially means protected area in Arabic, but it's a system that predates Islam by at least 1,000 years and potentially a lot longer than that. And this indigenous system maintained the fertility of landscapes in the Arabian Peninsula for thousands of years. It was abolished in the 1950s, and you've had serious deforestation and desertification ever since. So my job was to gain the trust of these communities, work with them very closely in prototyping a way to bring that system back, essentially. In a place with no soil and that gets water on average every other year, and 55 to 60 millimeters of rainfall annually. And for me, this was, a way to get into the kind of work I've always wanted to do. No, I wouldn't say always. When I was a kid, I thought I was going to be a doctor. But since I was an adult, the work that I've wanted to dedicate my life to. And I was familiar with the culture and the language. And then it was just a massive adventure. Like, is this possible? Like, there's so much rhetoric. And if we go back 15, 20 years, there's even still a lot of rhetoric about regenerative systems. It's just that word wasn't widely known. And my background kind of came out of the permaculture world, right? And permaculture makes a lot of claims about itself, some of which are quite outlandish, and many of which remain untested or unproven. And so for me, it was like, well, let's see if this actually works. Can permaculture actually do this thing that it says it's going to? In an austere place with no soil and almost no water, in one of the most challenging political contexts on the planet. And so that was, for me, it was, let's see if it's doable, right? Let's actually test it out. And it was a massive adventure. I have dear friends in those communities that will be friends for life. And that was my entry into the regenerative world. And I think because of the austerity and the extreme circumstances of that, it's put me in a salient position in this, I don't know what to call it. It's not an industry, in this community or in this world.
Yeah. I have a couple follow-up questions. One, I'm wondering what are some principles you've taken away from like this most extreme application? Like, maybe somebody's listening who's never heard of really regenerative agriculture, landscape, or permaculture. Like what are, basically what are the takeaways? But I'd also be curious to hear, and I don't know if you can answer these together, like what was it like trying to do that project basically against all odds, in like the most difficult circumstance, and then succeeding. I mean, the video itself spoke to that to me. I mean, at least for somebody who's been attempting to do a very small version of that in a place that's very hospitable. It was like, and I have any success, I'm like overjoyed. I can't imagine the low and high of that whole adventure. So be curious to hear.
Definitely big highs and big lows. I think on the takeaway question, it's kind of at the end of that video, but for me, the realization of the potential of Homo sapiens as a keystone species has kind of become one of my axioms. But that's a fairly new narrative as far as I can tell. The first time I heard that as a concept was from Ramis Kent, I think in 2017 or 16, and it clicked with me in a way because I'd kind of been living it. And it gets to a fundamental narrative about what is our fundamental relationship to the planet we live on, and who are we as a species. And there's a huge underlying narrative that results in all sorts of arguments, right? That has bearing on the sharing versus sparing argument. It has bearing on the concept of a footprint, right? Like the dominant narrative is that we're all inherently bad for Earth, and the best we can do is be as efficient as possible and reduce our damage. And the concept that, well, no, we can actually be good for the Earth is the nice way to say it is that it's extremely optimistic, right? It puts humans in a very positive light, at least potentially. And I think people find that inspiring. But if it weren't for, the thousands of indigenous systems that we can look at and my own experiences, I think I would disregard that narrative quite quickly because of the overwhelming amount of evidence to the contrary. Mm-hmm. The other thing I think I grew tremendously in that decade, right? I was 29 years old when I moved out there to take this on. Learned a lot about leadership, learned a lot about myself, learned a lot about, working in foreign cultures and working across cultures. I mean, I had employees from 6 different countries working with me at one time. Learned a lot about, I leveled up my own skill set, but I don't think that's what your question is getting at. I think in terms of in the international development world, which is kind of where I fit now, a lot of people give lip service to working with local communities, and I'm under the impression that very few actually do it. And the ones that do it, I'm not convinced that most of them do it right. So I think I've written about that a little bit, but people write about how it's harder to work with local communities or how it's unusual. But to me, where I'm sitting now, like, I don't see any other way to succeed. If you're really going for long-term impact and to really make a difference, it just seems nonsensical not to work and partner with local communities. So that's to the first question about takeaways. On the second question, I had bouts of deep loneliness because I was the one Christian American guy in surrounded by my Bedouin friends who were all Muslim and really wanted me to become Muslim as well. And it was a massive sacrifice for my family. I had a wife and 2 small children when I moved there, and they came to Jeddah as well. After the first year, they moved to Jeddah, which was the nearest big city where non-Muslims can live. and they had to pick up and move, and so there was a sacrifice for the family. I think there's a lot of good that came out of that, but a lot of hardship as well. On the highs, just truly sublime moments that pointed to me that we were doing the right thing.
Were you there? Were you physically there when that rain finally came?
No, not the one in the video.
Okay.
I was physically there from 2010 to the middle of 2017.
Oh my gosh.
And
Wow.
visited 2017. I kind of commuted between the US and Saudi. Flew across the pond, I think 4 times in 12 months. And then 2018, I left the project and went to grad school. And then went back in 2019 for a few months to kind of say goodbyes and do some follow-up work.
Okay. And
yeah, so,
sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, we'll leave it at that.
Okay. So I'm also curious about why was this project funded? And the context for me asking that question, what is here in Uruguay, it's like a pretty big grazing nation. And a lot of I'm hearing whispers that members of the government, and there's lots of large movement in this among ranchers. A lot of people are interested in regenerative agriculture and rotational grazing here. And I'm pretty interested and hopeful in like, governments incentivizing this kind of thing. And so I'm wondering, like, what was the thinking behind this project? Do you see more of that going on around the world, like leadership in places that matter, incentivizing these things?
So specifically to Baydha, this was a nonprofit endeavor funded by Princess Haifa and some close family members and friends. And their objective was primarily the people. They visited that region in 2009 and kind of became aware of the situation that people were in, and they wanted to do something about it. Right. And so they looked into all sorts of things where their objective was jobs and housing.
Okay.
And since I've left, the project has been primarily focused on housing developments. And so they funded the whole thing out of pocket, primarily as a philanthropic activity.
Okay.
And it speaks well to Princess Haifa. She's a pretty remarkable person, but her father was King Faisal, and she grew up with a very strong sense of responsibility for her country. And I think that's where it came out of. That she didn't get anything out of this. And so she, a wealthy patron who cared about the situation was this particular context. In terms of elsewhere, I see a lot of interest from the investment world in regenerative ag, one way or another. I see a lot of interest starting to show up in the policy world. I heard 6 months ago, I heard a US senator talk about the dangers of monocropping. And I was like, that was super unexpected, for a US senator to talk about how bad monocropping is for the country. So I do think that information is starting to trickle up into the policy making worlds. Whether or not that translates into real changes in policy or action, I think is going to be very context specific. But so that I see a little bit of top down work happening, most of it's bottom up. But there is a great, I see it in the UN and UNEP I see it at WRI and a couple of these other, really big multinational organizations that are, there's starting to be recognition of what regenerative ag, or at least of the potential, right? There's a lot of talk about potential and not that much in terms of results that can be demonstrated, at least not in a well-documented way.
Right.
At least that I'm aware of, right? And generally that's because people who are land managers or farmers, like it is such a hard profession. They've got to be biologists and chemists, and they've got to be COOs because they've got to time everything right, and then they've got to figure out how to sell everything. Like it is a super multidisciplinary profession with low margins and high risk. That's farming. Most people doing this kind of thing don't have the time to also film themselves and develop an audience and try to communicate everything. And so there's a lot happening on the ground as far as I can tell, but it's not being like studied and published and peer reviewed per se, except in some really salient cases.
Yep. I want to get into that discussion too, because I understand you've been working with Regen Network somewhat. And I'd like to hear a little bit about that because we had Gregory on a few weeks back, and I have some questions about legibility, like how does one measure this stuff, and like who does that burden fall on to, et cetera. But before we get there, I have a couple of comments and a question. One is, I think Prince Charles is pretty big into regenerative ag, the Prince Charles of England. So that's, do you have thoughts about it?
It would seem to fit what he's about. I don't follow Prince Charles per se. Like I'm not really an Anglophile.
Yeah, I don't follow him super closely, but I've noticed he's made some comments to the effect of, like local and indigenous British ways of farming and like hedgerows and this kind of like culture of caretaking the land through farming. So that's hopeful. I also think my sense is that whichever nations are sort of like start to buy into this early, if we're in a soil erosion situation or a fertilizer shortage situation, like the sooner the nations sort of incentivize this behavior, and like I think there's a process of learning or relearning this thing in the case of like the gauchos of Uruguay. I think that it's sort of like a risk mitigation strategy. So the more I see, nations, states, or even states, or even communities doing this stuff, I just feel like they're sort of preparing, and will be like a place where you can produce food sustainably in places, in the case that other people can't, who are doing industrial ag. Yeah. Before we move on from this project, I want to just hear what's the state of the project now? Has it continued on? I'm assuming something was impacted by COVID, or if there wasn't a COVID impact. I'm wondering if you've gotten any updates from the people there.
Yeah, they're working very closely with the Ministry of Housing. They're doing a 230 unit housing development where they're moving people out of cinder block homes into houses that are actually appropriate for the region. So they'll be using a lot less electricity and they'll be a lot more comfortable. It is in keeping with the settlement of these people that the government has been pursuing. In terms of the site we prototyped, it's still there, it's still living. It's not a rainforest. I get people every now and then who are like, I looked at your site on Google Earth and it's all brown. And I'm like, well, yeah, it's July and it hasn't rained for 7 months. I think people watch my video and expect that we've somehow superseded, the tilt of the earth and the latitude that we're at. And that's not the case, right? It's still subject to the wet, dry seasons. It's still going to go dormant when it doesn't rain for a year.
Right.
But it is living. Biodiversity is increasing, and there is a prototype there, a living template for an agroecology that could be deployed in the rest of that region, right?
Yep.
And it would be a silvopasture, which is what the indigenous systems were, but it would be, where it isn't indigenous is that it would be bolstered by tree crops rather than just tree fodder. I would say that's the primary innovation of that system we developed, is that, well, we did prove that it can come back, that we can bring it back. But beyond that, it's an integration of tree crops and tree fodder, where before it primarily would have been just fodder.
Why did you make that decision?
Mostly for resilience sake. If you've got a greater diversity of product streams, and the potential to do high value product streams, then it's just wealthier people are the result.
So I'm wondering now, where did that project take you? Like, maybe you could get us briefly up to speed as to what you're doing now.
So I left that project determined to never run a nonprofit again, because I did not enjoy spending a third of my time fundraising and talking to funders, with the knowledge that I'd have to be back a year later asking for more.
Right.
It's not to poo-poo nonprofits and the philanthropic world. They play an incredibly important role. But for me personally, there's got to be a way to do this profitably so that it's financially sustainable. So I left that. I went and did a year at Stanford and studied business and entrepreneurship, mostly because I knew I'd make a lot of mistakes starting a business that I hope to avoid. And then immediately after that, I started a company called Regenerative Resources with a group of people who have a huge amount of experience in what's called seawater agriculture. And they did a project called Greening Eritrea. For the audience listening in, if you YouTube Greening Eritrea, you'll see a project that they did from 1999 to 2004, where they converted a barren coastline in Eritrea into a functioning mangrove agroforestry. And I met this group of people February of 2019. I was halfway through my program at Stanford, and liked the concept so much that I flew down to San Diego to meet one of them, and we spent a weekend together, and it was like love at first sight. Because I'd been working up in desert mountains in the higher ends of the watershed, figuring out what you do there. They'd been on desert coastlines, figuring out what to do with seawater. And between the two of us, we were like, we can do comprehensive watershed development in a regenerative circular way. And it was like a missing piece of a puzzle had been found. So there was alignment with our personalities, alignment with our vision, alignment with our goals. And I think within an hour of meeting, we knew we were going into business together. So we started Regenerative Resources, and we are now focused on what is essentially a seawater-based agroecology, and deploying that throughout the arid regions of the planet. And this is one way to think about this system, is it's the world's first regenerative aquaculture. And another way to think about it is that, food production historically is so dependent on fresh water. And the risk associated with water scarcity is only increasing. And this is a system that takes an infinite resource, which is seawater, and totally barren coastal landscapes, and combines them to create an extremely productive, resilient, and circular system. It kind of blows my mind that I've been pulled into seawater stuff because I'm used to working in places with no water. And now we have infinite water. It's just very salty. And I can talk about this system for hours if you want, but that's what I'm up to right now, is deploying the world's first regenerative aquacultures on coastal barren landscapes, arid coastal landscapes.
Can you just briefly, I know it's hard to ask somebody who's an expert in something to briefly describe what they do, but can you briefly describe how the system works? Because I can't even really wrap my head around it. Yeah. And I'm pretty deeply into the regen stuff.
So the fundamental thing here are halophytic crops. Halophytes are plants that grow in seawater. And our first senior science advisor was the person who came up with this whole thing. His name was Carl Hodges, very, very renowned scientist who in the 1960s got a grant from the Rockefeller Foundation to catalog the world's halophytic plants with cropping potential. Right, so all the plants that grow in seawater that had the potential to become a food crop. And he identified hundreds of them and picked about half a dozen that he dedicated the rest of his life to working with. In addition to that, Carl Hodges was the first guy to figure out the shrimp life cycle so that we could grow shrimp in aquaculture. He's the person that made shrimp aquaculture possible because he figured out how to do the whole system from the hatchery all the way to production. So super influential scientist. And so we're working with halophytes, right? There are about half a dozen that we're very interested in. If we're ever, extremely wealthy, then we may put a lot of money into developing dozens of other crops that can grow in seawater. And so what I've done is I know about the systems that they did in Eritrea, that they prototyped in Mexico. They were going to get going in Egypt before the Arab Spring happened. And so the fundamental innovation that I'm bringing to this is I'm applying traditional agroforestry techniques with mangroves as the primary tree crop to these halophytic systems.
Jason, do you have a question? Because I have a couple of follow-ups. Oh, you're muted.
I have a different question, so go ahead with your follow-ups.
Okay, so what do you, I'm ignorant, but probably good, because then it makes the listener who's also ignorant have answers that they didn't have. What is the product of mangroves?
Goodness, you can do all sorts of stuff with mangroves.
Do people in these communities that you were prototyping this in, or is that something that they like a crop, a product they have to learn to use?
No, people have used the wood from mangroves for millennia, right? That's well known. The leaves have a number of different product streams, but they did a study in Eritrea with, I can't remember the name of the organization. One of the organizations that works with grazing communities and with animal health and animal fodder and that kind of thing. It's Mercy Corps, I think. They did a study where they found that, mangrove leaves were highly digestible for goats and camels. In fact, there's a land race of camels in Northwest India that only eat mangroves. And these camels swim out to the mangroves. Like imagine camels swimming in the ocean. That's this particular kind of camel in northwestern India that only eat mangrove leaves. So the fodder potential is quite significant. But beyond that, you can do textiles, you can do lots of stuff. But the mangroves aren't the primary crop here. The mangroves are more about the ecosystem services, right? So integrated pest management in halophytic systems can be performed by mangroves because they're habitat for all sorts of things. And then in aquaculture systems, mangroves are a huge advantage, where, I mean, let's talk about mangroves in general. I've seen numbers that 50% of the ocean species rely on mangroves at some point of their life cycle, right? They're a nursery for hundreds of species of fish. They're critical to the health of coral reefs that are next to mangroves. They provide a huge number of ecosystem services, whether it's protection from storms or sea level rise or hurricanes or cooling, but they're also the anchor species, right? So crab, lobster, shrimp, bivalves, they all depend on mangroves one way or another. In mangrove systems, it's the mangroves that are providing the base nutrient for that entire ecosystem to thrive. And so when you put that in a productive system, what that means is, in a constructed wetland, for instance, we can do oysters and sea cucumbers and algae and crab and lobster and all sorts of things. And if we plant mangroves around that constructed wetland, you get healthier animals, you get lower feed requirements. Right, so that's the agroecology.
I get it.
It's that we're doing constructed wetlands and growing all sorts of things in them, and mangroves are the anchor to that whole thing. So that's part of it. The other part of it is how we integrate fairly typical aquacultures, because we're on landscapes that have no water, no soil, and no fertility. Right, there's no like delta washing down nutrients. We're on super barren landscapes where there isn't any photosynthesis at all. And so where does the nutrient come from? Right, because you need your phosphorus and your calcium and your potassium, right? You need all, and then all the micronutrients. So what we've done is we've prototyped a system where aquacultures grow the halophytic crops and the mangrove forest. And from that mangrove forestry, we can generate feed for the aquacultures. And the aquaculture industry is notoriously dirty for two main reasons. One is they dump all their effluent into the ocean, right? Which creates dead zones. Like if you look at the potential for the creation of anoxic zones in the oceans, aquacultures are far higher than monocrop systems.
Wow.
Right? So the effluent's a big problem. The other big problem is the feed. Aquaculture feed is typically 60% of an operating cost. Right? So you look at any shrimp farm, any fish farm, feed is 60% of their total costs.
And what do they feed typically?
It's 1/3 soy, 1/3 wheat paste, and 1/3 bycatch. Right? Now, you guys immediately laugh because you know why that's so ridiculous. It's, the soy and wheat are just monocrops and they have their own problems, but the bycatch is a huge issue, right? For the health of the oceans, bycatch is a really big problem. And we solve both of those problems, because we pump our effluent through our halophytic crops and our mangrove forestry as the source of fertility, right? It's like a giant aquaponics system.
Right.
So we don't have the effluent problem anymore, right? We are a non-polluting system, and we're growing mangrove forestry with this effluent instead of dumping it into the ocean. But the other thing is we have proprietary aquaculture feeds that don't use any bycatch, that we can grow. We're not to the 100% level yet, but I think we'll get there, where eventually 100% of our aquaculture feed will come off of the mangrove forestry that's grown by the effluent. So the aquaculture grows the forests grow the feed for the aquaculture, and then you have a closed loop circular regenerative system that eliminates one of the biggest costs of our competitors, but B, also the massive environmental problems in the industry.
Jason, I'll let you go now. Sorry, it's been a while.
Yeah, well, I want to jump back, if you all don't mind, to something you said earlier, about kind of your experience, like kind of working with indigenous land management systems, and your observation that, kind of the creation of states was kind of, not very conducive to these kinds of communities living how they want. And I'm curious, I just kind of open up a broader discussion about, moving forward, what role, some people talk about concepts like decolonization, and we're bringing in new ideas, right? Like you're bringing in new ideas of what you were just describing, but we're also trying to capture some of the wisdom of the past. I'm trying to think about how to formulate this question, but like, how do you see kind of the political economy of this moving forward, and how states relate to this process of regeneration, and how, working with actual communities, indigenous land management systems in the context of, a national network?
Yep. Yeah, this is a really great question. My take on it is that deeper than the nation state is culture. And culture tends to manifest the kind of political making body that exists, because it's a social fractal. And I'll give you an example. Saudi Arabia is a country full of monarchies, right? Every family unit is a monarchy in Saudi Arabia. And that concept fractals up all the way to the kingdom. And it's manifested in really, really interesting ways that you wouldn't even think about. Like when I feed my kids breakfast, I say, what do you want for breakfast? Right? And I'll give my kids, 2 or 3 options. When a Saudi family feeds their kids breakfast, they say, here is your breakfast. Right? Kids don't have a choice. They don't have a say in it. This is what's for breakfast. Right? And that's because it's up to the head of the household what's for breakfast. And you don't get a choice. And so my kids have grown up with this idea that they have a say as a stakeholder in all sorts of decisions that affect them. Saudi kids don't grow up with that. And that's a social fractal, right? That family functions as a monarchy, and its monarchies all the way up. And so if we take it as a goal that we want to regenerate the earth, right? That we want to stave off environmental disaster and not drive everything extinct, then whatever we come up with has to be flexible enough to function within different parameters and within different social structures. And so regenerative resources on purpose is something where if we're working in a monarchy, we can work with a monarchy. If we're working in a capitalist country, we can be capitalists. If we're working in a country that's, more autocratic, then we can figure out how to make that work. Because there is such a massive variety of human organization right? And human cultures, that if we take it as the base goal that we want to heal the earth, then whatever we come up with has to be able to function within different structures. And so that makes me somewhat agnostic on the questions of political economy. In some places, we are outright purchasing land and we're going to manage that land, right? And I have no problem with that whatsoever. Particularly where it's dead land that no one else sees any value in, where there aren't any people. Yeah, I'll buy that. And I have no qualms about being a capitalist with it because it can help me move more resources into healing the earth. If it's land that's owned by a tribe, I don't want to buy it from the tribe. I want to partner with the tribe because they've got local experience, indigenous knowledge, social capital, political capital, and just a huge amount of awareness that I don't have. And if I were to be like, no, I just want to buy the land and you guys go do your thing, what I'm doing there is I'm skipping out on a massive opportunity to make it a successful endeavor, right? Because that knowledge and those people know so many things that I don't and that my organization doesn't, and that's extremely important. And so I'm taking I have a very utilitarian approach to that question, because in my mind, the most important thing is let's not destroy the planet and ourselves with it.
Follow-up thoughts, Jason?
Yeah, I mean, I tend towards the pragmatic as well. I'm just trying to think of, people who would object and say, well, if you have, what you would call like an extractive capitalist system, you can kind of greenwash, but it's still going to be extractive if there's not some kind of distributed ownership and incentives built in to I don't know, to value natural resources, things like that. Do you see kind of a failure mode to your point of view in terms of working with a system that would co-opt the goal of regeneration?
Absolutely. On that narrative, I would say first that I'm not extracting anything, because I'm going to places where there aren't any resources to start out with. We're creating resources, we're not extracting them. Which is partly why we're named regenerative resources. Because the way, and I would say in some places, there is a neo-colonial flavor to this because of the acquisition of land, right? Where we differ is that we are partnering with local communities and they are being treated as stakeholders and they are participating in the governance of what we do. The second thing I would point to is that the externalities we create are of massive benefit to the people around us. For instance, in a site that we're on in Mexico, we're downhill of a citrus village. I went and met some of the leaders of this community 2 years ago, and they said, we need help because our aquifers are drying up and we can't grow our citrus anymore and our community is collapsing. Right. And they actually asked me to help develop a solution for that, which I'm not able to do. We don't have the resources to do it. But if we end up on a site downhill from them, we're actually going to refill their aquifers. Because the way our system interacts with the hydrology of the watershed, we create freshwater lenses and start to restore shallow aquifers. I don't think that could be considered colonial, right? That's not extracting, that's restoring. And I think that is the fundamental difference, right? There are echoes in what we do that people are going to look at it and say, oh, this is just a white American company going into these poor places and taking things over. And we are taking some things over, but they're places where nobody sees any value and where people aren't there. And the externalities are only going to heal and help the people around us. So that's my contention. It's a fantastic question, one that I'm very cognizant of, but it's also, the other piece to it is, I find a lot of that narrative tends to be opposed to commerce in general, right? Or the idea of ownership or the idea of private property. But that's not something I'm in any position to change, right? None of us no single organization can be like, okay, guys, private property is gone.
I know.
Like it's too ideological for me, and there's no pragmatism in it. I'm like, look, we live in a capitalist society. How do I harness capitalism to heal the earth? Right? And if we take as step one, well, we can't heal the earth until we live in a social utopia. Well, we're never going to get there.
Yeah.
We have to work with where we are and within the structures that we have no potential to change, right? And so it's that circle of influence principle.
Yeah.
If we focus on things that we can't influence, then our power goes down and we are able to accomplish less positive change. If we focus on things that we do have influence over, then our power grows and we're able to execute more change.
Yeah. One more follow-up question, just kind of speculative. Do you think that, this kind of model of creating positive externalities instead of negative externalities, kind of the opposite of extraction, for the kind of the idealistic person who wants to think about changing economic systems, do you see this kind of changing this dynamic conducive to, say, in the future, more, say, commons-based management systems, or
Yes.
like do you see kind of regeneration of the earth as perhaps an engine towards eventually the kind of change in social relations as well?
I think in some places commons are absolutely necessary. The public goods problem is where concepts of private property fall apart. And so there definitely does have to be a mix there. And I'll tell a story about a community that we're working with on the Pacific coast of Baja. Hold on. We're partnered with 3 fishing villages where their catch has decreased by 90% in the last decade. Right? They're facing collapse of their communities because this common resource is so degraded that they can't fish anymore. And that we have it's one program, but 4 projects that we want to carry out with these communities. 2 of which they recommended, right? We've spent 1.5 years building relationships with these communities, getting to know what the issues are, identifying solutions that they already know about, and then seeing how we can execute on those together. That's our model for working with local communities. Is there's a lot of relationship building and a lot of finding people who have already identified solutions but don't have the wherewithal to execute them. So and that's common. It's common to go into a rural area and find people who say, I know how to solve this, I just don't know, I can't do it, right? In this case, it was a woman named Abuelita Marta, who we asked everybody we talked to, we said, do you see a future for fishing for your children, right? And these people have been fishing for generations, right? They're a fishing village. That's what they do. And everybody said, no, there's no future in fishing here because the fish are gone, except for a grandma whose name was Marta, who said, yes, there's a future for fishing here. And what it means is putting in quotas, collaborating with all the fishing teams, and stewarding the ocean. And if we steward the ocean, the fish will come back, right? Now, she doesn't have a high school diploma. If I said the phrase tragedy of the commons, or if I mentioned Eleanor Ostrom, she wouldn't have any idea what I was talking about. But she already knows the problem very intricately, and she already has the solution, right? She gets it. She knows how to solve that problem. So the question then becomes, well, how do you create the economic space to give the fishery rest and allow for a reorganization of the management of that resource? So here's what we're doing. They proposed a mangrove reforestation project because they do have degraded mangroves and people are starting to cut down mangroves because they can't catch fish anymore. So which we have launched, we've grown about 100,000 mangroves in the last 2 months in this area. And we are looking to finance that project further. So we're doing about 12 million mangroves and probably 3,000 hectares of seagrass restoration for the restoration part of this program. And what that will do is it will help increase the health of the fishery by increasing the biodiversity and the habitat for the commercial fish that spawn in the mangroves, right? And the people know that the mangroves are critical to the health of the fishery. The second project we're doing is, which we haven't done yet because we don't have the permits yet, but we will build a regenerative seawater agriculture system. RSA is what we're calling this regenerative aquaculture. We'll build an RSA system that's large enough that we can hire all the fishermen. All of them get a job. They get security, they get an income, they get to pay for their families to live, right? They can afford to send their kids to school, et cetera, et cetera. And in being able to hire all the fishermen, or, and clearly not all of them are going to come at once, right? Like I'm talking about this like it's a really simple thing. It's extremely complicated, okay?
Yeah.
This is the objective. Give all of the fishermen a job and rest that fishery for 3 to 5 years. Right? Nobody fishes for 3 to 5 years. It rehabilitates. And then we can work with officials and everybody else, all the fishermen, all the communities, to reestablish that fishery as a commons. Right? And then it can be managed sustainably indefinitely. But to get to the point that you can do that to the fishery, you've got to create the economic space and the security to give that fishery rest. And
sorry, you go ahead. I just want to say just a quick clarifying question. Who is paying, like what's the business model for like this particular project? Like who is going to give the fishermen jobs?
We are.
Like where does that come from?
It comes from the RSA.
Okay.
Right?
And
so they have hundreds of thousands of totally barren coastal land. Hundreds of thousands of hectares. We need about 10,000 hectares to be able to provide about 1,000, 2,000 jobs.
Okay.
And that system will produce all sorts of stuff, but it's shrimp and bivalves and sea cucumbers and mushrooms and a whole bunch of other stuff. At least a dozen different high value products, like high margin products that come off of it. And then the restoration project is going to be a blue carbon deal, right? It'll cost us about 25 million to do the seagrass and the mangrove restoration and the monitoring, recording and verification and the biodiversity credit machinery that we'll do off of that. But it should generate between 2 and 3 million tons of carbon credits, which will generate between 50 and $100 million. Right.
So that leads into our next question. We were wondering about this, like that whole part, although we probably don't have enough time to go deeply into it, because we spent what did we spend 2 hours with Gregory trying to understand that, how all of that works. One side comment I want to make is I think part of our orientation with Doomer Optimism is like, I think there's a lot of people who really just want to stay in the doom. And those are the kinds of people who just say, like, you can't solve anything until there's no private property, or like in the case of my school, we're working with universities and they're like, well, universities like charge students too much. It's like, well, I'm not going to solve like the whole problem with US higher education by working with them, but like, I recognize it is a problem, you know, whatever. So I think there are people who kind of just want to stay either in the problem space or criticizing space, or the, you know, basically telling the only solution is a perfect utopian future. So I think for us, like the pragmatic is pretty central. Like you have to move towards something that's actionable, that would actually make some difference. And so we're like really attracted to people who have that orientation. So I don't know if we can briefly discuss this question, but something that I don't think we fully got out of the conversation with Gregory, if I'm honest, is like the legibility problem. So if like part of what funds this restoration project is carbon credits, who is measuring these ecosystem services and carbon capture? Like, because I think a lot of people don't really, I'm sure you're thinking about it, but a lot of people don't really think about the energy and expertise and attention that goes into measurement in general. Like they're just like, yeah, we'll just get some data on it, and they don't think about like what that actually means for people. So, you know, I wonder if you have thought about this, and then the problem of maybe I don't know who's collecting the data, maybe that'll answer the question, but like the problem of expecting farmers to collect data on carbon, and that to them is like not really something that would really make sense for their whole understanding of their whole operation, et cetera. So
it's not going to make sense to farmers until there's a much less expensive way to do it. Even with mangroves sequester carbon at much higher rates than tropical or temperate forests. But even with mangroves, it's got to be at scale before it makes sense financially. The fact that the price per ton is going up is helpful, very helpful for us. But it's, you know, for a farmer on 500 acres, you know, he's looking at, it's not going to be worth his while in general. The MRV is monitoring, recording, and verification. The MRV piece is quite complex, and we have a suite of collaborators and relationships that are going to be performing those roles, including Regen Network, but also Restore. In the case of biodiversity, our data collection is going to be in partnership with the Cornell Bioacoustics Lab. So we're working with Cornell and a company called Nature Metrics. We're working with Biosphere 2, different aspects of this at the University of Arizona. Depending on who we do the carbon credits with, they tend to have their favorite verifiers as well. So there's different organizations that are dedicated to the minting of carbon credits, and they have their preferred verification standards and entities, right? So if we go with Vera, or if we go with Gold Standard, or if we go with Climate Action Reserve, you know, they all have their own preferences. So there's a lot of work that goes into that. Some of which can be done via satellite data, right? If you're talking about biomass. and some of which needs to be done through soil sampling and like core samples and stuff like that. So there's fundamental science that needs to get done, needs to be verified by independent parties. And because we're not just doing carbon credits, we're doing biodiversity credits. We have a separate suite of things going into the development of those as well.
And so like for a layman, who is the person going to the place and measuring the soil? Like who's paying them to go out there and get that soil and measure it? Like how does that, do you know what I mean?
Paying for it. We pay for it.
And who is the person you're hiring?
It's not a person.
Like the team,
It's going to be different in each location. Like in Mexico, it's going to be a combination of SIBNOR, NASA, and Restore. SIBNOR is a government science body that does all sorts of work, but they're close to us in La Paz. They're more than qualified to do the work. It would be a very different group for our project in Spain and a very different group for our project in Namibia. So it's not that there's at least the way we're setting it up, it's not a one-stop shop. But okay, Regen Network does do a lot of that work though.
And how are they involved? Well, let me just repeat back to you what I heard. There are already existing research scientists who have training, who are either affiliated with research universities or institutions or government research institutions, who you pay via your whole budget to do this verification. You're not like expecting small scale farmers to get trained in doing this. You partner with organizations, scientists that come out and do this measurement.
That's how we're doing it, yeah. But I'm also the farmer, right? Like we're vertically integrated. We are doing the farming, but we're also doing the land development and the design and the commercialization of like we're kind of a vertically integrated regenerative development company.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense to me. And then and then how does Regen play a role?
Regen plays a role in the MRV, and they also can play a broker role, right? They can set up the carbon deals, and then they can. Well, that's the easiest way to put it: MRV and brokerage. I think Gregory would probably dispute that. He'd say that they're doing more than that, which they probably are. But in our case, the role I see them playing with us is an MRV and as a brokerage, helping set up the deals and finding customers.
And when you say they're involved in MRV, what does that mean? Like, in what way are they involved in monitoring, recording, and verification?
This is a better question for Gregory than for me.
Okay.
I know that they have access to low orbit satellite data.
Okay.
That they use for a lot of different things. I don't know that they're doing actual soil science beyond data that they can collect remotely. But that's a better question for Greg.
And do you, I don't know, Jason, I want to let you have a follow-up, but like, do you have any qualms or concerns or like, I don't know, I guess it's just you're trying to be a pragmatist. So I don't want to just be a naysayer for no reason, but do you have qualms about like the measuring of a lot of this stuff via satellite? And, I think Gregory took issue with us, or me, I shouldn't say us, I don't want to throw Jason under the bus, saying, something related to the panopticon, for the sake of measuring regeneration, like now are we just in a fully surveillance state? Like people out measuring soil and ecosystems everywhere, and like, I don't know, scientists in lab suits. It's like, I can imagine something very dystopian here. Or is it worth it, like for the small amount of measurement for understanding the regeneration, if you understand my question?
Yeah, we're already in the panopticon. You're carrying around a tracking device with you 24/7. You probably sleep with it next to your head.
Yeah. So is this question the equivalent of somebody saying we should abolish private property?
No, I don't think so. But I think that what this would add to your concern about the surveillance state is tiny, right?
Okay.
Like, this isn't going to be the thing that pushes the NSA from being a benevolent defender of the nation into being a tyrannical observer, big brother kind of thing, right? It's
Yeah.
not going to be satellite measurements of soil that pushes the NSA over the cliff. I would say we're already there, right? At least technologically. We may not be there legally in the West and many other places, but it's technologically we're already there. And I would suggest that your concerns about this particular aspect of it are overblown. That
Okay. I mean, yeah.
that being
Yeah. Sorry. Go ahead.
I think what these tools make available are really they're a breakthrough. There's the saying that what you do not measure, you can't improve, right? Or that we value what we measure.
Yeah.
And the technology coming on board to allow us to track things like biodiversity and water resources and biomass are going to make the possibility of us valuing nature more. Extrinsically, I would say. I think many people intrinsically value nature, or at least claim to. But this tech is allowing us to address issues that previously have been externalities, and they're allowing us to internalize them in ways that we couldn't before.
Okay, so yeah, that's a sound argument to me. And then the only real follow-up I have, and I don't want this whole conversation has been Jason and I being like naysayers, like, are you a colonizer? Are you the panopticon? But the last question I have is, are you part of the New World Order? In other words, are you potentially doing something that could enable corruption and or like control by elites in negative, directions, like as in, making things legible, incentivizing maybe behavior you don't want to incentivize, and or the largest or most powerful, corruption in general kind of question. So I'm sure you're thinking about this, so I'm wondering your thoughts.
I think corruption is part of the human experience. I think universally we're all subject to it one way or another. I think we're all tempted by it one way or another. I think the acquisition of power makes us more susceptible to it.
Right.
What we're doing is we're laying the foundation to create new indigenous systems on land that is extremely barren or degraded. And for me, my perspective is that we're all indigenous to Earth. And very few of us act that way. But we all are. We're all indigenous in a very real sense to Earth. But we don't necessarily have indigenous cultures or indigenous practices. And for me, regenerative resources is about using the technology that's available to us now to see if we can't create new indigenous systems. The human issues that you're talking about, colonialism and corruption and all this stuff, we're all subject to it.
Right.
I'm not immune to it. You guys aren't immune to it. Are there ways to create structures that minimize it or that provide insulation against the damage it can do? Yeah. But those are specific to different cultures, right? The way you deal with corruption and different definitions, I would say as well. I would say that things that we view as corrupt in US society would not necessarily be viewed as corrupt in Saudi Arabia or Russia or the Philippines or Uruguay or Mexico. And so you're asking me to solve the problem of human nature, and that's
Well,
not,
I know, but I also am like, I think
that's just something we
specifically,
can work with.
no, yes, but I know I also am like specifically thinking of like the Bill Gates Foundation and the World Economic Forum types, and like the stories I've heard of people gaming, you know, the carbon credit system, like Bill Gates owns the most farmland in the US, and you know,
Sure.
it's like, you know, that kind of thing where it's like the most powerful could potentially say they're doing good for the environment through various means, and it sounds like you're building a system that that like basically where that couldn't potentially happen. But this is a major critique that a lot of people make of like the carbon credit system in general. So I just thought, you know, be good to give you a chance to.
No, I mean, anytime you have a new market that's hot, you're gonna see chicanery and fraud.
Right.
Right. And as the market evolves, you find ways to weed that out. Right.
Right.
That's why MRV is so important, actually, because then you have third-party verification of certain claims being made. But there's no question that there's fraudulent carbon credits out there. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't value carbon.
Yeah.
And it doesn't mean that there isn't a right, just because a lot of people may be doing it wrong, doesn't mean that there isn't a right way to do it.
Yeah.
And to me, carbon is a crude stand-in for ecological health. Like I have been open in my criticism that the focus on carbon is myopic. Right? It's when we think of climate change as only having to do with carbon and fossil fuels, that's a myopia that ignores the greater issues.
Totally.
But it can still be a very useful tool for bringing back ecosystems, right? Right? Even if the premise is flawed, it can be harnessed to create things that are extremely good. Mm-hmm. I met a gentleman from Northern California I don't remember the tribe he's part of, but he's part of a tribe. They're using carbon credits to reacquire land that was taken from them in the 1800s.
Oh my gosh.
They're buying back their tribal land using carbon credits as the revenue source for it.
Oh my gosh.
Which is awesome, right?
Yeah.
Like, awesome.
Yeah. I mean, it's just total. Yeah.
And so it's a tool, right? You can build a house with a hammer, or you can kill somebody with it. It's not the hammer that's the problem.
Yeah. Jason, I'll let you ask the last question, but I just have to say that that's lovely. And and all your stories and everything, I just have this intuitive sense, like you have a very thoughtful approach, and it seems very much like your values are aligned with mine. I mean, it's just like, I love the abuelita story, because for me, the thing that I'm always yelling about is, you know, I think there's just so much knowledge out there for people who get mostly ignored. And so working with people who have that deep knowledge, we don't first just go to like the soil science expert at Cornell, like let's first go to the woman in the village who has an idea. And so I think that's like total Ashley Bates story. I'll let Jay, sorry, go ahead.
It's a comparative advantage.
Right.
Right. To put on my capitalist hat, we're going to have a much more successful business working with Abuelita Marta than if we don't.
Right.
And if I can put it in those terms, then I can start to convince other corporations to start doing the same thing.
Yes, and I could not agree more. I think sometimes you do also need to speak the language of the person you need to convince. And I'm often working with PhDs, or at least trying to talk to PhD environmentalist stuff, and I just have to use their language to get them to understand the value of what I'm trying to describe in terms that they understand. And I think it's okay to be to code switch in that way, to try to bring in diverse sets of stakeholders and explain things across cultural context, even the cultural context within the US of academics versus farmers, explaining across these cultures. Jason, you go ahead, ask the last question. We don't want to take it too much of his time.
I have one question, but then I also want to, after you answer that, I want to leave it open if there's any last things you want to say, or if there's something you wish that we had asked you and you want to answer it. I want to leave it open for that. But I guess in terms of just the larger kind of regenerative finance economy, we know that these markets are exploding, and part of it has to do with kind of political requirements of fiduciary responsibility and things. Yep. And there's all these new technologies coming online with having to do with the blockchain, and that's, I know Regen Network focuses a lot on that. I guess I'm curious, where do you see this movie in 10 years, and what are the main drivers of it? Is it just that governments are starting to take it seriously, and so it's a political movement, or is it primarily happening within the market itself, and capitalists are feeling guilty, or what is driving this, and where do you see this ecosystem, as well as the complexity of not just measuring carbon, but measuring ecosystem robust health and community vitality? Where do you see this all going?
By this, do you mean blockchain, or do you mean regenerative finance?
Both, and how they interact, how blockchain, my understanding with Regen Network is they see blockchain as kind of facilitating much more efficient brokerage and transactions and things. Yeah.
I don't think any government cares about regenerative finance. I don't think it's on anybody's radar. I think they do care about blockchain, particularly because it threatens existing power structures, but also because it has huge opportunity. It's kind of like the internet, right? I remember life before the internet, and life after is not at all the same. And so blockchain, I think, does have the potential to be an internet kind of deal. And where there was pornography that drew the growth of the internet, we're kind of in that phase right now where it's money laundering and photos of weird looking monkeys that are driving the development of blockchain. But it's gonna evolve just like the internet did. Where do I see it going? I see a potential to create markets for externalities. That's what I like about blockchain. The fact that you can wrap data into a product and sell it, really interesting to me. And the criticism of, let's talk about NFTs. The criticism of NFTs is that you own something that's infinitely copyable and you don't actually own a physical thing, right? Like you could buy an NFT of the Mona Lisa, but it doesn't mean you own the Mona Lisa. In the case of biodiversity, that's perfect, right? Because I don't want to sell you 1,000 species of birds, right, and ship you birds in a cage to your house. I want to collect the data that proves that I have more species of bird living on the site that I manage as a result of my management. Right? And this happened in Eritrea. They went from 25 species of birds living on site to almost 250. They had a 1,000% increase in biodiversity, but you can't sell the biodiversity, but you can wrap the data in a product and sell it in a nice package. And all of a sudden biodiversity has a market, right? All of a sudden we value biodiversity because there's a product and wealth attached to it. So for me, it's about, when we talk about working with nature, to me, that means also working with human nature. And human nature includes an impulse to acquire and to hoard and to, display status, which is what NFTs are. NFTs are a digital Rolex. That's why people pay $200,000 for a picture of a weird monkey.
Right. So do you think that most of the finance, that's like where the money is actually coming from to pay for these externalities, is it coming from hijacking kind of status games? And you're saying it's not really coming from governments or even legal responsibilities in kind of the legal system, but it's actually just coming from hijacking status games?
That's my impression. Yeah, it's people who think they're going to make money by buying a digital asset that someone else is putting value on, right? Which I'm fine with, right? Working with nature means working with human nature.
Jason, if you're done, I'm so sorry. I have one other question I wrote down that I didn't yet ask. So like, if you could wrap up, like, what is the big picture goal here? Like, what is the potential if this sort of work that you do takes off and sort of goes in the direction you want to see it go into? And I guess like tied up with that question is what can regular people do, if anything, to get involved in this, and basically the work of regeneration?
Yeah. Do you mean me personally, or do you mean the industry, let's say?
Wait, which question? The first part? I would say like the industry, like what's the potential if the kinds of work that you are doing spreads beyond even just this, I guess, what would maybe considered be somewhat niche industry.
Yeah.
To be something greater.
Well,
in the strongest possible terms.
Regenerative resources. I'll start with regenerative resources because it's easier to. I've made a commitment to myself that we're going to grow 1 billion mangroves before I retire. I think there's over 15 million hectares globally where our RSA system can be deployed, and it will enable the restoration of millions of hectares of ecosystem restoration, right? Seagrasses and mangroves primarily. And so for us, it's the metrics we're tracking are how many jobs do we create? How profitable are we for the economic side of things? How much habitat for biodiversity have we created, right? Like how many millions of birds now have a new home or a new stopping point on their migration because of our work? Carbon is obviously one we need to track because we can monetize it. And then what are the broader effects? We have a thesis that our system will increase rainfall. Can't prove it yet, but I think it will. That's something we're going to track, and something will prove yes or no. And that's because we're in these coastal areas. But if we look at the regenerative movement, let's say, as a whole, what can we do? I would say that we can reverse the poverty degradation cycle in lots of different places. We can create balance. There's this kind of argument. This gets to some really deep stuff about, Malthusianism and the wizard and the prophet and I don't know if you know that book, but
Yeah.
This concept of degrowth versus infinite growth on a finite planet, I think is a really, really deep discussion that we don't have time to get into. But fundamentally, regenerative systems can produce an infinite amount of goods over time, right? They contain an infinity because they're not dependent on external outputs, and because they reconstruct the foundation on which they are built, right? And that's actually everything, right? Everything is built on a foundation of soil, water, and ecology, right? Every civilization, every society, we depend on those three things fundamentally. And to the extent that civilization amortizes those resources, then civilization contains within itself the seed of its own destruction. And so for me, it's about, can we create human societies that don't involve that amortization, that don't involve that degradation of the fundamental resources, water, soil, ecology. If we can, and to the extent that regenerative systems create those, right, or reinforce them, then they are infinite systems. They can last indefinitely and produce indefinitely. And that then, because they're increasing those resources, it means that the limits of the planet can actually expand. So if you're thinking about donut economics, and Kate Raworth's work, what regenerative systems do is they move people onto the donut, but they also expand the outside of it. And that's amazing.
Yeah. And
that's amazing. But that's what they can do. That's what regenerative systems can do.
And do you make the claim that these kinds of systems can slow or reverse climate change and or make the effects less extreme, like drought and flood?
The second part, absolutely. I mean, a third of the corn belt in the United States is devoid of topsoil.
Right.
Based on that study from UMass, right? When it rains on those areas, they get way worse floods than if they had a functioning prairie.
Right.
Right. The fact that we've dried up all the wetlands, we've created disasters. Right. And that is the amortization of civilization I'm talking about, right? We end up in this cycle where we're degrading the things we depend on, and it makes everything worse, at least in the long run. In terms of reversing climate change, technically, I don't think that's the right kind of language. I think I've used those terms. I've used the term fight climate change before.
Yeah.
But again, I don't think of climate change strictly in terms of carbon, right? That's a myopic take on it. That's not to say that carbon isn't important, right? But what is it? It's, according to Walter Jena, carbon is responsible for 4 to 5% of thermodynamics in our atmosphere, and water is 80%. Right? Beyond carbon, we've completely messed with the water cycle.
Right.
Right? Beyond
People don't realize that water vapor is a greenhouse gas.
Yeah. Super important in how the earth responds to heat. But also super important in all sorts of other things, obviously. Our systems, if you're ever on a boat in a storm, you're supposed to go find the mangroves. It's the safest place to be. Right? So I have no problems making the claim that our mangrove systems are going to protect the coast against storms and hurricanes. That's a proven thing.
Right.
In grasslands, it's about flood. You know, you plow up the grasslands and you drain the wetlands. Of course, they're going to have worse floods. You dam the rivers, of course, the ocean is going to swallow up the coastline. You don't have the sedimentation anymore. And so the ecosystem services provided by these systems are oftentimes worth much more than the actual products we can produce, because there's no way to monetize it.
Yep.
Right? Like our system will protect a city from a hurricane, but will the city pay us to grow a mangrove forest there? It's not likely.
Yeah.
Right, but someone might buy the carbon.
All right, we're already over an hour and a half, so I don't want to take any more of your time. This was so lovely, this conversation. I'm so glad you came on. I'm such a big fan. Yeah, and ways for people to get involved, if anything, to follow up with you.
Oh goodness, buy our shrimp next year.
Where can they buy it? Where can they find it?
The first markets will be and are likely to be Tucson, Phoenix, San Diego, LA, and Las Vegas.
Okay, well, tag me and Jason. We have probably a combined following of, I don't know, we probably have the exact same following. So whatever Jason's following is, it's the tag him.
But yeah, it'll be the world's first regenerative shrimp that grows mangrove forests.
Amazing.
Awesome.
Yeah, Neal, this was a real honor to be able to talk to you. Thanks for giving us your time. Just before we wrap up, I know we're out of time, but is there any last things that you want to say, and any last parting messages to our audience?
No, but it's been a pleasure, and I appreciate the invitation.
Lovely.
Great.
All right, we'll let you go. Have a good one.
Have a good one, folks.
See you on Twitter.